Thanks for joining us on the Week in Review. I'm Amanda Vinicky. Paris Schutz is on assignment. First tonight, the attacks are getting sharper as the race for mayor nears.
If you're really going to crack down on guns, you have got to get serious about charging people who violate gun laws.
Strained relationships between law enforcement, particularly in black and brown communities, is something that we have to prepare.
Crime is front and center, but so too are verbal attacks between rivals Paul Vallis and Brandon Johnson, as the candidates try to burnish their campaigns with cash and endorsements. What the outcome of the race could mean for the city's schools.
It was really a remarkably fast just explosion of cases.
Coping with COVID-19 3 years in.
We have a lot of people walking around trying to find things to complain about. But every once in a while, the speaker gets to do what he wants to do. Every once in a while.
Wiretapped calls played at the trial of former ComEd executives give jurors and the public an inner glimpse into the operations of the once almighty and secretive former House Speaker. While in Springfield, the current crop of lawmakers pass a flurry of bills. Busy as they may be, is anything as busy as the Kennedy now that a 3-year construction project's underway? Joining us to talk about all of that and more is part of our Week in Review panel are Ray Long of the Chicago Tribune, Nader Issa of the Chicago Sun-Times, Quinn Myers of Block Club Chicago, and also Jacoby Cochran of CityCast Chicago. Thanks to each of you. Now let's get right to it. Quinn, I'm going to go to you. You have been following the mayoral debates. There were a couple this week. We've got more ahead. There have been so many. Anything that you learned, though? Anything that's different?
Not really. I think it's really kind of the talking points are being brought up again and again this stage in the campaign. I think we've had 5 debates, at least 2 more. We're about a week and a half out from the election. The thing we keep hearing about is public safety and education, as I'm sure we'll get to, but public safety is still the #1 topic. And the candidates are really going after each other. Brandon Johnson wants to promote 200 rank-and-file police officers to become detectives. Paul Vallis at a debate this week basically said that would be totally ineffective. Meanwhile, Paul Vallis wants to bring back retired police officers who have left the department in the past couple years. Brandon Johnson called that a ridiculous proposition, and so they've been really kind of sparring on some of their main tenets of their public safety platform. I don't think that's going to change. I think they've narrowed in on that as the #1 issue, for better or for worse. There are other issues besides public safety and crime out there, I promise you. And they've gotten into that a little bit, as I'm sure we can talk about. Education being another one, taxation a little bit.
But crime is what they are asked about a lot, and certainly top of voters' minds, it seems, as well. So, Jacoby, I mean, what of that? Each of them do have actual public safety plans. Give us your take, and in particular, do you think retired cops are going to return to the force if Paul Vallis is Mayor Vallis? WTTW's looked into this and things like, no.
Yeah, I've tried to find a precedent around the country for retirees returning en masse, and I haven't been able to see it. I think both have tried to sort of grab a sort of number that is easily relatable for people. So for Paul Vallis, it's trying to fill 1,100 vacancies. For Brandon Johnson, it's promoting members from the rank and file to be the 200 new detectives that he believes will solve crime. I think, as you find with most campaign promises, they sort of leave a lot to the imagination. I don't think any of us believe either of these, even if implemented within the first 100 days of the first term, will have a drastic overhaul, but this is the plan and they're sticking to it.
Vallis is endorsed by the FOP as well as other law enforcement organizations. Would that make a difference, even if it's not maybe retired cops coming back? Might it, I don't know, ensure more trust? Ray, you're nodding some.
Well, it just seems to me that Vallis is trying to offer an olive branch of sort to a police force that has felt like they've been stomped on for years, sometimes with good reason. But it looks like these are some of the things that are difficult to pull off, and it is hard to understand where you're going to get a number of people to come banging through the doors here to come back and work on this police force.
And we keep hearing about Vallis' talking point of beat integrity. Let's get cops to the same neighborhood every time, not sending them around the city, and then a so-called, quote, humane work schedule. Let's not cancel their days off. So I think he does think, or think politically at least, that that will be a winning message, not just to police officers, but people who are firmly, supportive of police officers.
An olive branch to police officers. Nita, what does that mean, however, we're still, at least for me, very fresh, the murder of George Floyd, the movement that followed, and calls, including by Brandon Johnson, though he's now backed away from it, to defund the police. Does that sort of overture to law enforcement mean that Vallis would be coming in hurt with cops? Or I don't know. Let's also take off from there. Brandon Johnson really saying that that needs to be the focus, communities.
They both, Paul Vallis too, has said you can't get police officers on the beats, you can't push that policing down to the community without there being community trust. And he's talked about building community trust. There are a lot of communities in Chicago. I mean, there's been a lot of talk of the racial politics in this election, black communities. They're not a monolith, and I think there are a lot of black communities that want to see police officers in their neighborhoods, but there's a lot of people who don't, and I think that is why Paul Vallis is hitting Brandon Johnson so hard on the defund issue, is because he thinks that there are some more conservative black communities that might not want to see police removed from their streets.
And then, Quinn, before we move away from crime, there are some differences as well in terms of their actual policies that they want to institute. I know they've been asked about, both Johnson and Vallis have different opinions when it comes to things like the sharpshooter technology that detects shot spotter, thank you, that detects the sound of supposedly when bullets are going off, although there also is very questionable foot chase policy.
Right.
Takeaways there.
Sure. I mean, they're actually connected. I think if you look at the shooting of Adam Toledo, that police officers were alerted to that because of a shot spotter technology, right? And then that led to a foot pursuit, which led to the department reviewing its foot pursuit. So these are all kind of connected policies and technologies. Brandon Johnson has been critical of what happened, obviously, with Adam Toledo. Paul Vallis has kind of walked a finer line, and he has been more supportive of ShotSpotter. Brandon Johnson, I think, at the WGN debate on Tuesday, I believe he called for the city to end its contract, or at least seriously rethink the millions of dollars it spends annually with that company.
All right, last word on crime goes to you, Jacoby.
I'm just interested to see, come April 4th and whoever is elected, what will they actually be able to do within the first 100 days? I don't think sort of these rapid hiring process or promotion process are going to be as easily delivered as either of them are promising. And ultimately, with this new community oversight, I want to know, how do they plan to partner with the different oversight commissions in the city to build a more trustworthy police force, if that is even possible?
And presumably, number one task will be to find a new CPD superintendent to oversee all of that. I suppose that 100-day stuff, maybe that's on us. I think we ask that question a lot. I'll call out ourselves as journalists. Now, Nader, however, for some quality reporting, let's turn to you and really focus in on education and what CPS is going to look like under a new mayor. A lot of changes coming in there. So what in general is the overall picture for what CPS is going to have to deal with? Big budget concerns.
There's a lot facing the school district. As much as we talked about Lori Lightfoot's tenure being dominated by education, that's going to be the case again with a new mayor, whoever it is. Within the first year or two of coming into office, the mayor is going to deal with a $600 million deficit at CPS. They're going to deal with the end of the Chicago Teachers Union contract and new negotiations. They're also going to have to figure out funding, because of the deficit, funding going to the state, trying to get more state funding. It's only 70% adequately funded, the district is, according to the state's own metrics. So there's a lot to figure out over the next couple years for the mayor, and they both have very, very different visions for how the district should move forward.
No, Nader, I know in your sort of reporting you did ask the current head of Chicago Public Schools about that, and really there's a big ask for the state to come forward with more dollars. And he said that CPS is the largest school district in the state of Illinois, and therefore, because they're not receiving enough money, CPS students suffer the most. But Ray, you've covered Springfield. is that going to have any sort of sway with a downstate legislator who maybe has an itty-bitty school district, but is also terribly funded, at least ratio-wise?
Well, the downstaters are always going to say, oh, the city's getting too much money, et cetera. One of the interesting things about this story that Nader was working on is that Miguel Del Valle used to be a state senator, and he has a good handle on what he can ask for and what's realistic. Asking for the hundreds of millions of dollars seems to be unrealistic in any kind of way unless people want to pay more taxes in their income tax, and I don't see that happening right now.
I don't either. You can ask, but you're probably not going to get it.
Yeah,
I
I think the dynamics are different, but if Chicago pushes too hard, they're going to have a lot of trouble getting it.
Okay, so Nader, if not state money, have we heard any sort of ideas from either Vallis or Johnson about how they will make up this really big hole?
No, that was asked. There was Brandon Johnson was in front of Crane Chicago's editorial board, and they asked him, how do you fund all of these new programs if the state or city council don't cooperate? And he said, that's just our plan A, and we have to go with it. And I need stakeholders, I need the business community to help figure out a plan B, C, and D. Paul Vallis, if you ask him, he says that he can accomplish what he needs to at CPS with the money he's got. I find that hard to believe. There is a lot of need, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic. Students' needs are at an all-time high. Their academic progress is stunted a little bit, social progress, and there's a lot of need in CPS. And simply right now, not enough money. They're finally getting closer to the amount of money that the state really thinks CPS students need to be adequately educated. But that's only because enrollment's dropping, and so you're spending more money per student.
And that's another issue unto itself. I'm going to go to this side of the table in just a moment, but Nader, I want to stick with you briefly. A component of this is that CPS says we don't have the same abilities as do suburban school districts, which can go to a referendum if they say want to build a new school building or to make up for some of the needs that CPS is dealing with. Why is that? Give us a really quick kind of tutorial.
So, ironically enough, this touches a lot on Paul Vallis's time as CPS CEO. If in Chicago Public Schools, if they want to build a new building, if they want to renovate, anything that has to do with buildings or capital investments, they have to go secure, they have to go issue bonds, they have to go borrow, essentially, to be able to pay for whatever
those huge
renovations.
Expenses. Sure.
Yeah. That's different than every other district in the state. CPS CEO Pedro Martinez made this comparison the other day. If he's in Naperville, that school board can say, okay, I need to go build a new high school. I'm going to go ask my taxpayers in a referendum on the ballot, and they can say, yes, we want to pay more and let you build this building. Chicago can't do that, and so the CPS estimates that's because of old bonds, old debt that they're paying off. It's about $550 million a year that they're not able to put into classrooms, into their operating budget. A lot of that old debt was from Paul Vallis's time as CPS CEO. He made this maneuver with pensions where he worked with the state legislature. Pensions were fully funded at the time. The markets were doing well. He didn't have to pay into the pensions. And so he took a lot of money and put together a very big capital improvement plan, built a lot of schools, renovated a lot of schools. CPS is now seeing the effects of that. They've seen the effects of that over the past 10 years because they built up all this debt. When the market soured in 2008, one, the pensions weren't funded as well, and two, they built up this debt.
So there we go. And this is something that we hear, of course, from Brandon Johnson in terms of the legacy that Vallis has left. You hear this often, that everywhere he's gone, he fails. Yes. So, Jacoby, do you want to jump in there? Any sort of thoughts in terms of Vallis? And by the way, kind of new Vallis, however, though, is that before he was a candidate, was on some right-wing talk show, kind of co-hosting, and said that J.B. Pritzker was a dictator for going around the General Assembly to enact mask mandates. Is that going to be something that hits voters the right way, the wrong way?
At this point, I do feel like even though we have a good crop of undecided voters, I think people kind of have a sense of what are the issues that they're voting on. And when you think of Paul Vallis, one of the things that I think is important is, as Nader's saying, a lot of the consequences of his choices are being felt now. And I think it's important to ask, like, who are the people you keep close to you? What are the policies you keep close to you? And when you look at Paul Vallis, for example, he still seems to be looking at some of the policies that are now being rejected, thinking about standardized testing, you know, school choice, which we know sort of leads to divestment in neighborhood schools. And so when you're starting to have this conversation around education, you could say that the Chicago Teachers Union and blame them for what happened, but we were dealing with the global pandemic. And what we've seen over the last 11 years is that this union has been able to secure huge victories for teachers across the city, have been able to grow their political momentum.
And the issue with the criticism of keeping schools closed during the pandemic, I mean, we covered this extensively. This isn't distant memory. This was just 2 years ago, 3 years ago. Even when CPS did open its buildings, about a fifth of students, a quarter of students actually came back. Families just were not ready. They didn't feel safe. There were a lot of operational problems at CPS. They tried to do an at-home testing program. Tests piled up at mailboxes. They had a lot of
Johnson
issues.
hasn't taken very well to that criticism. By the way, Johnson continuing to have to defend himself against the accusation that he's a wholly owned subsidiary of the Chicago Teachers Union, but Quinn not coming up with a whole lot of room for distance there.
He's been asked about that at every debate. He says he will be a mayor for all of Chicago, for working class Chicago, and that's kind of as much as we heard about that.
And then we want to get to, of course, endorsements, because these are the candidates working around the clock to raise their profiles, especially through endorsements. Let's take a look at how one such hit Paul Vallis this week.
You know, it's been a really long campaign, but this has got to be the highlight.
It's okay, yeah.
Quinn, what's going on there? An emotional candidate.
With Paul Vallis and Bobby Rush, I don't exactly know what's going on there. But I will say, with all the endorsements we're seeing, you have to ask, how much do these actually matter? I think in aggregate, they matter. You want to be able to point to a group of people who are saying, these people are behind me. For Paul Vallis, you want to be able to point to a diverse coalition behind him, especially after some of the flack he's gotten in the campaign, right? For Brandon Johnson, I think the Chuy Garcia endorsement did mean something more than maybe some of the others, because it was a unification of, you know, the people we tend to call progressives in Chicago, whatever that
And perhaps the
term even
Latino
means
vote
anymore.
as well,
The
not
Latino
a
vote,
monolith, but...
Absolutely. You know, Bobby Rush itself, that was a really interesting, I think, odd endorsement for a lot of people. Bobby Rush lambasted Mayoral Lightfoot in 2019, calling her the FOP candidate. She has never been endorsed, actually, by the FOP.
Now Vallis is
Now
literally
Vallis
the
is,
FOP candidate.
And he was asked about that, and Bobby Rush, by the way, who co-founded the Illinois Black Panther Party back in the 60s, not exactly a group friendly to police, he had a quote saying, there are some good ponies and some bad ponies about police. So not really sure what to totally make of the Bobby Rush endorsement. I do think it matters a little bit. As a whole, it matters more.
Well, and then some other big endorsements that have come. Arne Duncan, the former U.S. Secretary of Education, with both candidates really focused on that matter, is backing Vallis. And then you have Bernie Sanders also getting into this race, and he, in fact, is planning to be in Chicago for a big event for Brandon Johnson, a Get Out the Vote event. But, Jacoby, in terms of the Black and Latinx politicians who are backing Vallis, there's not all. There's a spread here. Sure. There's sort of a rainbow coalition. But what is going on there with this divide you see, particularly in the Black community of leadership?
I mean, a great report came out this week from the Tribe, and a fantastic report of Tonya Hill over there. And one of the things we should remind ourselves is, even if we look at historical turnout with Harold Washington sort of galvanizing this multi-generational, multiracial coalition 40 years ago, there were still Black politicians, brown politicians who stood up and said, I stand next to Jane Byrne, and politicians who stood up next to Daley. And so I think it's important to, one, ask ourselves, as Quinn said, how much do these endorsements matter? But also, let's ask ourselves, well, do these endorsements of Jesse White and Bobby Rush, do they really represent maybe what young Black people in this city think, right? What people who are in my age group, who are in their 30s think? Because if you look at Bobby Rush's long-held 1st congressional seat, well, the new congressman there is Jonathan Jackson, and he voted for Brandon Johnson, or he's endorsing Brandon Johnson. When you look at some of the old guard of Danny Davis, he's endorsing Brandon Johnson. And so it really is sort of where the connections, and when you look at a Paul Vallis with Bobby Rush, Jesse White, you also look back in their history and you see political connections there. You know, Paul Vallis has been around for a very long time, even if he's never been an elected official.
And then there's Jamal Green.
who also backing Vallis. And by the way, if you are feeling educated and inspired by watching this, early voting did open this week on Monday. That said, election officials are still in need of 1,000 more poll workers. So even with voters voting by mail, you got to have people serving as election judges. I want to move to the other huge political story, sort of being overtaken by the mayor's race, but that is the ComEd 4 trial. Now, ex-Speaker Michael Madigan, he has a later court date for himself, but his voice via wiretaps is very present in this case. Now, Ray, what, outside of just intriguing for those of us who have only seen the public face of Madigan, actually hear how he leads behind closed doors and on secretly recorded calls, what are you making of what you have heard from them? Does it show that the iron-fisted control he said I didn't really have, that he did?
Well, I thought the clip you played at the beginning of the show where he says, you know, once in a while the speaker ought to be able to get to do what that was tongue-in-cheek for sure, because we also had a guy, Bob Rita, who's a current lawmaker, come up and sit on the stand and say, you know, he ruled through fear and intimidation. So what we've got here is a real boxing match. This is almost the Thrilla of Manila here. and we've got great lawyers on both sides, and they're rolling out candid conversations that we always thought probably happened, but we now are actually getting to hear the deep, deep background and the connections that they have, where we have Mike McLean, who is on trial, giving Mike Madigan all kinds of advice, and Mike McLean was even called a double agent by one of the ComEd officials who said, well, you know, he's working for us, but he's also working for Mike Madigan. And McLean has openly said, my client is number one, and that is Mike Madigan.
And that is a sentiment that was echoed by another former top Madigan aide who went on to lobby and said in one of these calls, I missed a meeting with my actual paying client because I instead prioritized Madigan, who isn't paying me except for probably what, Ray?
Well, Will Cousineau is who you're talking about there. He was Madigan's political director. And
wouldn't have gotten that job without Madigan.
It would be hard to believe that he would have this kind of client folder full of heavy-duty clients here. He got a job with a Washington-based lobbying firm, but he was actually offered a job with ComEd. Ann Pramaggiore, who is actually on trial right now too, in the same case, is a person who offered Will Cousineau a job to work with her, and when he turned it down, they made another offer, and then she came back and made a higher offer and a signing bonus offer. But
Ray, you and I have covered this right now as we speak. At least last I checked, legislators were actually still in session because it's a deadline week in the General Assembly, so flurry of activity there. But how much of this is legal lobbying, and how much of it, Jacoby, I mean, you care as a voter, how much of this do you say, okay, he's the Speaker of the House, of course he's going to have a top aide twist arms to get legislation passed that he wants. How much of that's just politics, and how much of this do you think could be crossing the line? It's voters like you who are going to be making that decision.
I think that's the question that we're going to see answered in this trial, as well as when former Speaker Madigan's trial begins in April, is, you know, what do we want our politicians' roles to be and responsibilities as it comes to relation to these utility giants, as it comes in relation to lobbyists. You know, when I talked to Dave McKinney from WBEZ on CityCast Chicago last week, he made it clear that some of the utility bills that govern how ComEd works in our state are some of the most dense bills that we've seen over Madigan's time in office.
Yeah.
And in that, they've made hundreds of millions of dollars based on rate changes that most of us probably could not break down or understand. I just paid a ComEd bill earlier this week. And so it's not...
Are you a little more incensed paying it as this trial is going on?
And I have no idea how this trial directly impacts that bill, but I know in some way
you pay
or
it
fashion,
and you're like...
it has impacted it. And so ultimately it comes down to how transparent do we want our politicians to be? We understand, regardless of what you put on the book, if you have political power, you're likely going to be able to get people jobs without doing things illegal. But it goes beyond that. How closely do you work with lobbyists to the point that you're having them sort of funnel your plans through rather than people who are directly on your staff?
Ray, we've got 1 minute, so I want to just see your take on this legal lobbying notion, or just in general, if there's anything in the calls you heard from Madigan that seems on Madigan from the public persona to you?
Well, I think that's a good question. I mean, the candor is really something that you and I would not have heard down in Springfield during press conferences or just catching him in the hallway. But has he crossed the line? That's the big question. There's a lot of things here that may be implied, but nobody is going to say it out loud. And really, are you going to say something explicitly if you're a guy as smart as Mike Madigan? Doubtful.
No, but even if you don't know that the feds are recording, a real quick question. We got about 15 seconds. So even though it's supposed to snow this weekend, we've got the summer lineups. Jacoby, Quinn, are you planning to get tickets to Pitchfork, Lala, and who do you want to see?
Definitely Pitchfork. I want to see Big Thief, and I think I'm gonna head to Ravinia to see Santana and Lauryn Hill if she show up this time.
Oh, there we go. All right, we'll see if we can get to you guys in just a minute because we are out of time. Our thanks to Ray Long and Nader Issa, as well as to Quinn Myers and Jacoby Cochran. Thanks to each of you. So yeah, Nader, you planning to hit up any shows?
I am not thinking past next week.
Yeah, fair enough. So okay, election first, Ray.
Well, that's a good cop-out.
All right, that works for me because I want to talk about the Kennedy in this construction.
Oh, man.
Anybody else feeling like their rage rise already?
I avoided it, luckily, for the most part. But 3 years is
lucky you. I mean, I
time.
take the CTA, but you can't always.
It's been this way my whole life. So I'm like,
So
construction, highway, they go hand in hand.
Well, Jacoby, I mean, I know you make the big bucks at CityCast, right? So you're going to hire one of these special planes that United's going to have to.
I work with. I did hear about these new express air taxis that's going to go from the Illinois Medical District on here.
Yes.
Honestly, I have no reason to be in the Illinois Medical District, but I might take it there before I
Maybe
go
we
home.
can charter it and like get a group going.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm that's proud to serve its community through pro bono legal services.
American Masters profiles mezzo-soprano Janae Bridges and country singer Reese Palmer. See how they use their voices to inspire change.
I want to make sure that I'm telling the truth.
In the Making on American Masters.
Tonight at 8 on WTTW.
Next time. During a chess match, one of the competitors dies.
Lab found significant traces of poison on the White Queen.
But the team can't figure out how the killer did it.
It was locked in the case all night.
Death in Paradise.
Saturday at 7 on WTTW.
On Frankie Drake Mysteries.
Florida Jack, he called himself.
Frankie and Trudy's moms are the victims of a scam.
I might have dipped into the family savings.
Frankie's old friend, a former gangster, agrees to assist them.
Joe is going to help us get the money back.
And as the team works the case...
Look at this.
Nora